2000. Actually, I left at the end of 99 and then. Did it with K on. You think about the family.
We have just saw the stuff with Neanderthals kind of drives me crazy because you can say virtually anything and it'll get published. It's like, it's just, left-handed. Responsible for why we get COVID. Neanderthals,
I think Neanderthals gave us extra immunity.
That's just it. Like, every time someone comes up with something, they can get it published,
Put it in post.
Like, I just, it's crazy, Neanderthals, grapefruits, Neanderthal, like all of this, just like anything you say, I think, because I just love that word. So I just think that just.
I like Neanderthals.
That there's single
Population.
that just answers the question.
It's hard to believe based on my experience.
I just think really just is. Yeah, of course, right? Yeah.
Oh.
That's speciation. That they would have tried. Oh, okay.
Is this the introduction?
All right. We're just gonna wait.
We're all enjoying eavesdropping on you. We should get going. Berkeley after all.
We'll get back to this for a minute. This is for later. I would like to welcome Professor Jennifer Fish. She is an associate professor of biology at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. She's an old colleague from Arizona State University. She got her master's at Arizona State when I was there. She was a year behind me. Left in '99, went to King's College. Got her PhD in developmental biology because anthropology was a little squishy. So she wanted to get into hard science. And we have collaborated on several projects where we continue to collaborate on things. And she's an old friend. We were on the basketball team together, Department of Anthropology team. So, anyway, she's going to talk about sex, gender, and developmental biology. So, welcome.
Welcome, everyone. It's exciting to be here. So as Brian said, I have some background in anthropology. I got my master's in anthropology. And then, here we go. And then I went on, I sort of left anthropology because I was more interested in understanding. So a lot of what I was interested in was the evolution of modern humans, evolution of brain size, and how do we, a lot of the things that we understood in anthropology is based on you find a skull, right? Or you find this or that. And every bump is meaningful or it's not meaningful. I wanted to understand more about how the skull develops so that we could then think about how what's meaningful. Anyway, I went to study developmental biology. What I do now is, in my research lab is developmental biology. So that's where I'm at. Most of what we study is the process from fertilization to early embryogenesis. I don't really study a lot of that. And predominantly what I study is development of the skull, of the jaw, and we also do some work on limb development. But I teach developmental biology to students. And one of my goals, we talk about bias interests, is in getting the students engaged and to get them to think about how we know what we know, the importance of being a citizen scientist. So you're a scientist, how do we use that to engage to our own benefit? And what I realized is that students are really interested in this topic of sex and gender. And so I was looking into where can I get more information to really use as teaching tools. And I couldn't actually find a lot of things that I thought were useful on this topic. So I decided this was officially my sabbatical. I'm going to write a book. Because even though I don't study the development of sex, I have, I think, some ideas about how development works and those important developmental principles that might apply and how we can think about that in terms of problem solving. So what I'm going to start with are what are the goals and definitions of this talk is to use these principles of development. So how we go from DNA, that's genetic code, to making an individual, morphology, right? So our bodies, basically. And incorporate concepts from evolution, selection, adaptation, that might help us create meaningful definitions, concepts of sex and gender. And why do I think this is useful? Because we're interested in policy building or whatever our personal goals might be, we need to have shared definitions for that. And I think we need to try to the extent that we can, ground those definitions in science. Because as soon as we deviate from that, we're going to end up in trouble. So in my context here, I'm going to try and ground it in biology. And also part of that is we talk about why does this thing matter? So about sex, why is there sex? What is sex? Why is sex? And so I'll get to that. So what is it that, just to start, that I think are some concepts just in general that can be to this discussion is, so I mentioned what we do is we study development of the skull and jaw. So for example, I'm showing you here, this is a mouse embryo at mid-gestation, which is 10.5 days, and then a mouse skull at birth, basically neonatal. And the embryo that's there on your left, this actually looks very much like human embryo. They're quite similar at this stage. This is a pharyngeal arch. It's basically just a ball of cells. And somehow that ball of cells will almost without fail produce like you see on the right. And it does so, the incisors are always distal, the molars are always proximal, the jaw joint is the jaw joint connecting with the upper jaw. And you don't find incisors where molars are and molars at the front of the mouth. It just doesn't happen. So development has ways to ensure that the pattern is generated consistently. So that's what we call pattern formation. Morphogenesis is how you get shape. So some of the things that we think about is what are the rules of development, or how does this work? Development, in this case, constrains variation, but we also need to think about generation of variation. And I'll mention this in two sort of ways. So in the case of the jaw, we can see in these three examples that jaw size varies in disease. And for a character like the jaw, that's really bad, since this is involved with feeding, which is essential to. So the jaw development has a number of factors that are important to reinforce the jaw shape, as I showed you, that consistent shape. Those mechanisms are what we call developmental stability. So that is the ability to buffer genetic mutation and or environmental perturbation. So to reduce phenotypic variation, because for the most part, phenotypic variation during individual development lifespan is bad. On the other hand, phenotypic variation, morphological variation, is important if you want evolution, for evolution to occur. So developmental systems have these two things that are important to how they work and that are subjects to selection. So the ability to create a system that generates adaptive variation, but also buffers against maladaptive variation. So these are concepts that I think we can relate to sex. So we start with this, think about what is sex. And I'm just going to pause for a moment before I put some of the things up here that I found, and you can do Google searches and find millions of definitions. But you just think for yourself, would you define sex? How do you think society defines sex? And you might also think in gender. So just allow yourself to imagine what those definitions might be. How would you define sex? So does anyone have any?
Based on the role in reproduction, gestation versus dissemination.
Okay, so you hit a key word there, reproduction, that I think is fundamental, right? So you can think about your own definitions, but I'll give you a few. So this is a definition from, it's a Canadian Research Funding Institute, where they say sex refers to a set of biological attributes associated with physical and physiological features relating to chromosomes, gene expression, hormone levels, function, and reproductive anatomy. So that encompasses a lot. Something like Planned Parenthood, I think was the next one. Sex is a label. I guess label is another term for definition that they would say is your doctor assigns you based on genital, so anatomical description. I'm not sure that some tests are often done, but I guess in some cases they do. So that would be a Planned Parenthood definition. So these are just two examples, and I'll give you a third one. And again, getting back to bias, I would say I love Planned Parenthood. I support them. As I do with the ACLU. These are groups that are doing fantastic things. I disagree with their definitions, and particularly this, like the idea that sex is binary as a myth, like it's a leprechaun or something like that. I think is not something I would say. So a couple of, please come in, yes. In particular, so what I might agree with is that there's no one way for our bodies to be. But the idea, first of all, is I talked about these definitions in this case, and in some ways, combining sex and gender. Here, I don't think it's. I would agree, and you'll see data. There are no set hormone ranges, no chromosomes, for example, that per se correlate with sex. However, there are body parts, and that's where I will give you my bias of what is the definition of sex. So this is my definition. And as I say, I'm in the process of trying to formulate a book and ideas on this, and these are still in flux. So feedback and comments will be appreciated. So, but I'm going to start with a definition that sex is a set of morphological characters that facilitate reproduction, and that in humans, sex is binary. There are males and there are females. And from the evo-devo perspective, I can go further to define those characters, the specific body parts that I think binary, and those would be having ovaries or testes. And that would be like, if you think just about animals in general, things that we might characterize as body parts would differ. So for example, birds don't really have external genitalia, but they have ovaries and testes. So those morphological structures associated with reproduction actually are binary. So if we think now, so getting into this idea, part of my definition of why I think it's important to say that is the concept of why do we have sex? So why do we have sex? So is there a way to make this so that it's not blocking?
Move to the right. Drag to the
Does
right.
it?
No, good. Move to the right. Just drag to the right. There you go. Keep going. There you go.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry if that's been blocking. I didn't realize, and I was moving it so I could see. Okay, so sexual reproduction as opposed to asexual reproduction, which is asexual reproduction is essentially cloning. Sexual reproduction, two different individuals, potentially producing numerous further different individuals. So this concept of variation. And this concept, how does this come from? So in the concept of sex, we generate haploid gametes, and those haploids involve separation of the chromosomes. So basically, any haploid gamete is just going to have half of the chromosomes that you would have, right? And so if you just calculate the possible number of different gametes that you would get, considering the fact that there are 23 or 46 chromosomes of being haploid, this produces something over 8 million different gametes. That's a tremendous amount of variation. Now that's just assuming that these chromosomes segregate as they do. But another huge advantage of sexual reproduction is that when we go through meiosis and we have this separation, there is a phenomenon called crossing over, where there can be recombination between sister chromatids. So this now recombination makes the possible gamete outcomes immeasurable, right? So just the potential for variation is phenomenal. So this is the primary advantage of sexual reproduction. And so we can think about that in an evolutionary standpoint. This variation is really important when you have adaptive variation, right? So actually, sex is costly. So it's a lot more efficient to clone yourself. You don't have to find a mate. You don't have to worry about sexually transmitted diseases. There are a lot of reasons why sexual reproduction has disadvantages. But there are many studies that show, modeling as well as experimental systems, that sexual reproduction is favored in changing environments or places where resources might be limited. There are also other components of sexual reproduction, this ability to segregate, that really helps relieve the impact of accumulating deleterious mutations. And sexual reproduction has evolved many, many times, so also suggesting that it is adaptive. So sexual reproduction requires gametes. So here we see the egg and the sperm. And in humans, there are two gametes. You have eggs and sperm. There's no intermediate, there's no third gamete, right? So that's why I say sex is binary. Defining it on reproductive structure, given that sex exists for reproduction. Failure to produce gametes ultimately would lead to extinction. So there's very high selection demand on producing these gametes. Now, I'm talking about gametes here. There's more to sex than just the gametes, of course. And really, if we think about biological sex, we think about many characters. And you can think about these in terms of primary sex determination, which is typically considered associated with those morphological characters that are directly involved with reproduction. So in females, that's going to be the ovaries and the uterus. And then we have characters that are considered secondary sexual characteristics, and most of these are, let's say, less directly associated with reproduction. They're more related to aspects that would draw in a mate. And in fact, are under sexual selection. Breast size has definitely been selected in. So similarly for men, the primary sexual development or sexual development or sexual mutations in the testes and sperm. And then there is secondary sexual development, which is more related to external anatomy and medical features. So the important thing about this is that sex development is hierarchical. So in early embryogenesis, this is in humans around the 3rd to 7th week of pregnancy, you have this bipotential gonad. And this sort of bipotential system, bipotential tissue, bipotential cell fate is very common, especially in early development. So this occurs in the ectoderm. You have the ectoderm needs to make neural tissue for your brain, and it needs to make skin tissue, and you need both. And so there are these mechanisms that create what are referred to as developmental switches. So a key factor of developmental switches is that typically you have master regulators. So genes that are really important, they sit at the top of developmental hierarchies, and they regulate developmental programs. So in the case of sex development, the SRY and also SOX9 are two key master regulators of male sex determination. And then there are master regulators associated with female. So here you see FOXL2, for example. The key component of these switches is that, for example, SOX9, you see that there are a number of inputs. So when something in development is really important that you seal a fate, it's very typical that you have this sort of system where there are multiple inputs reinforcing a positive outcome. So in the SOX9, we have multiple inputs there. And then the opposite fate is repressing. So SOX9, while promoting all of this male identity, is also going to be inhibiting these major regulators for female identity. So you have this developmental switch. And another important point I would like to make about this diagram is that we have early development which is in this idea of robustness or developmental stability, is higher early in development. So these reinforcements on these major gene regulatory networks are stronger early in development, which means that as they become, well, I would say the point is as they go further in development, there's less reinforcement, so there's more potential for variation. So whereas if you were to compare sperm across many males, they would look very similar. However, if you were to compare components of the external anatomy, you're going to see more variation. So that's typical of developmental hierarchies. So a key point here is that we have these developmental switches that allow this mutual inhibition so that you get these binary decisions. So that is an important component of development. Now, if I'm arguing that sex is binary, that's not, there are people now who would say biological sex is a spectrum, and this is a figure from Scientific American. And again, they have this hierarchy. So hierarchy of developmental genes, processes from conception to birth to puberty, and that, you know, these different arrows showing different aspects of this process. And then you see the spectrum here from a typical female to typical male, and then all of this in between. So it has a spectrum. So, and these would be various, let's say a broad category that that is often referred to as intersex. So what is this? Now, how would I explain this? And I'm going to explain it by taking an interlude to something that I study. It's been a lot more studied in terms of this concept of robustness, developmental stability. So it's Halloween, have a skeleton. So human skeleton and anatomical position. So key feature of humans is that we have limbs, and that these limbs have a certain structure. So we have humerus, we have the radius and ulna, and we have a hand, digits. And these actually are conserved modules in all limb animals. And then of course, and an important feature of this, especially for most animals, or animals that would be quadrupeds, is that they be equal in length. There's a high functional demand for limbs to be equal in length. And if you think about it, the limbs are developing pretty independently. So you have a limb bud on each side and it's developing out. And so how is it that you make sure that those limbs end up the same size? So there are these gene regulatory networks that are involved with that. So here I'll just show you a few. And the key one that I want to point out here is sonic hedgehog, which is a key regulator of digit identity and number, as we will see. So in development, so this is a limb bud, and this is an early limb bud shown here on the left, and on the right is a slightly later limb bud. And key feature of developmental systems are these signaling centers or emergent properties. So we have genes that regulate different FGFs. These are fibroblast growth factors, as well as sonic hedgehog, which is another signaling factor. And part of what happens is their expression domain leads to an interaction. So we call this emergent properties because there's no part of the genetic code that says sonic hedgehog and FGFs interact in this space. It just happens as they are expressed there that they start to interact. So these only pictured here are more or less 3 major gene families, but there's a ton of genes that are involved in this, shown to be involved in this, and they are more or less conserved. And the way this works is that this tissue at the very distal edge of the growing limb is expressing these fibroblast growth factors. They're signaling to sonic hedgehog and is giving a positive feedback. And then what happens is that as the tissue grows and the distance between those signaling factors increases, they can no longer see each other and they no longer read the signal I should grow. And that's how they know when they stop. Because you can imagine a system that doesn't have this, and you just say, I'm going to put 10 cells here, and they each divide 10 times, and then I have 100 cells on each side. Well, that's great, unless something goes wrong and you lose 1 cell, and then you end up with a limb that's one limb is 10% different. So development doesn't risk that sort of situation. They create these constructs that allow size to be measured. This is a way the embryo can actually measure its size outside of individual cells dividing. So these feedback loops are a mechanism that help regulate size and symmetry. So what we know about this is I show you here FGFs in that distal area, and then sonic hedgehog, which is in the posterior limb bud. So there are actually 4 key fibroblast FGFs, let's just say that. And they're expressed in this domain that create a gradient of low FGFs anterior, high FGFs at the posterior. 4 of them are expressed in the posterior half, only FGF 8 in the top half, and that is to ensure that we have outgrowth everywhere, but only feedback loop on the bottom. We only want sonic hedgehog down here because it's controlling digit identity and it needs to be restricted. Now, if you create an FGF8 mutant, or if you have a mutation in FGF8 that reduces its expression, we don't get enough expression on that anterior end. What happens is that FGF4 is upregulated. So its expression domain extends above in order to make sure that there's still sufficient FGF levels on the anterior of the limb. This is a mechanism that is what we call canalization. It's reinforcing this developmental stability because it's really important that we have limbs that are of equal length. Now, I think I just have one here. This is just showing the actual data, showing that in these mutants, so this is a mutant here on the far right, that FGF4 is upregulated, and we have these sequential hybridization, so showing that FGF4 here in this mutant, a lot more purple, that's showing the gene expression that normal doesn't have a loss. So this is just the data. If you're interested in the actual embryos, we can talk more about it later. But so development is canalized. That doesn't mean that it never goes wrong. So congenital limb malformations, I'm showing you a few here. There's all sorts of things that can happen. So individual that has a lot of toes, it looks like the big toe on each side is fused and actually has 2 phalanges on the end are duplicated. We have reduction in digit numbers. So this is a common sort of mutation. And there you can also go on the internet and find whatever sort of shape you want. There's something like this that has large extension. And then of course, you can have lots of the limb bones, not just in the digits. So the thing is that development goes wrong. And what we know from studies, so this is a study that was done on Belgian families that have polydactyly. They were able to do genetic screens between affected and unaffected individuals, and they sequenced the locus. I guess we want to get rid of that. How do I get? Okay. From sonic hedgehog, that gene that is important to digit identity, and what they found was a specific mutation. So it's somewhere in here. That mutation created a binding site in the regulatory element for sonic hedgehog. So in a normal sonic hedgehog, you have sets of binding sites, so however many there are. And they created a mouse mutant where they inserted that mutation, and what it does is effectively add another binding site. Those binding sites are where transcription factors or proteins come and activate the expression. So if you have more, you will often get more expression. So what you see on the left here is this is a normal sonic hedgehog expression shown in blue at the posterior end of that limb bud. And with the mutation, you can see that sonic hedgehog is dramatically increased, and it's also up here where it shouldn't be. So this will cause an increase in digit number, but that's also going to affect digit identity, whether you have pinky thumbs. So this is what we call a mutation that contributes to developmental instability. So coming back to our skeleton, and the point I simply want to make here is that the human bowel plan as tetrapods is that we have 4 limbs, each with 5 digits. And if you go around and ask people, how many fingers kids have, I've never heard someone say, well, it's a spectrum. They don't say that, even though we've just seen that it's possible to have more than 5 or less, right? So these are things that are not part of the normal body plan, and it's not, the body plan is there and that has been selected for what's adapted. So that's the point I'll make with that. Distribution of sex. I'll get back to it shortly. So birth defects are common. Birth defects occur when developmental robustness fails, do not reflect body plans. So my argument is if we're talking about a definition of biological sex, our definition should follow the body plan. It shouldn't also include when the developmental robustness fails, because we don't do that for other body parts. So why should we do that for sex? So coming back to this spectrum, and this is just highlighting that middle part of that figure, you see typical biological female on the left, typical biological male on the right. And in these various, in this case, genetic, the different known genetic developmental sex disorders. And in the medical field, that's what they are referred to. So some people can also say differences in sex development, but I do think it's important to talk about the fact that these are disorders. So coming to part of what's happening here in the context of what's going wrong is, so some of these mutations may affect in part hormonal levels. So that's part of what goes wrong. And coming back to just another figure here on sex development, getting back to this point that the early part of sex determination is regulated by these gene regulatory networks. We have a lot of positive feedback to really encourage our particular pathway and then opposing negative feedback. But then downstream of that, as we start to get into the sex determination or differentiation, and we have the formation of our sex-specific anatomy, hormones come in. And so you can see there are a number of hormones here, and these are variable. There's absolutely no evidence, and I'll show you that. So there are trends that overall females are express or have lower levels of testosterone, but those don't really follow a binary. And the other point I want to make with this is that this part of development becomes slightly more prone to perturbation, and I'll give you an example. So something that I talk about in my developmental biology class, and who doesn't like to see frogs having sex? So 2 frogs here. The smaller one on top is the male. And the way frogs reproduce is that the male will take this position and squeeze the female. And as he does that, she will release the eggs. Then sperm is released on top of the eggs so that they are reasonably close. And that's, of course, occurring in water. And it's external fertilization. So frogs have genetic sex determination. And the chromosomes are slightly different. And actually, in this species that the example of, the males have the homomorphic DZ, and it's the females that are heteromorphic in terms of sex chromosomes. So this is a story of environmental contaminants, in this case atrazine, which is a pesticide that was commonly used. And here you can see where it was used and concentrations. And of course, this can get into water supply. And if that's where your frogs live, you're going to be exposed to that. So what happens? So the top panels here, if we just look in columns, so these are 3 individuals, and these are all genetic males. So this is a control male that hasn't been exposed to anything. This is what a frog looks like, a male frog looks like externally. These are the testes. These are 2 genetic males that have been exposed either to different amounts or there's other components that had a different outcome. So on one case, this genetic male still is a phenotypic male having testes. You can see that the external genitalia have shifted to what would be more, this is like a female phenotype. And in this case, this genetic male has external female genitalia and also is producing eggs. So then they look at some behavioral implications of that. But how is that working? So you have in here, this is a control situation where they have genetic male and a genetic female. So this first panel is a PCR to detect presence of these different chromosomes. So the female has W and the Z, and the male just has the C. This is detection of the expression of a gene called aromatase, which is present in the female, and it would be coded for on the DMW. This is just a control to show that the experiment works. Now, in the case of these atrazine exposed individuals, they are genetic males, so they do not have that DMW chromosome, but this one, the one that is phenotypic male, has high levels of expression of this aromatase. This one that phenotypically male does not. So what's happening is that atrazine is stimulating the production of this aromatase. So even though there's no genetic code for it, the genetic code would code for genes that would normally induce stronger aromatase expression in females. But in this case, the atrazine can get around that. So it's stimulating this conversion. And so now these genetic males, even though they don't have the genes that would normally produce as much of this estrogen-like compound, they're able to convert testosterone. And the reason why I bring this up, other than stress a little bit of the importance of these hormones, is to say these pollutants are almost certainly not only affecting frogs. And so at some level, they're going to impact all life forms. And I think that that is worth noting. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say for the moment about biology of sex. And I'm going to switch briefly to this a little bit of why does sex matter? Why we care about definitions? And this is also part of the topic where I'd like to think, if I were doing this in a classroom, would I get the students to think about why sex matters, right? And how it might impact broader society. So you can think of your own reasons why you might care about how we define sex. So I think we all might have ideas, and I'll get to what I think is important about it in a minute, but certainly from a societal level, competition cares about it. And the Olympics seem to care about it. And they have sex verification. They say of athletes, but it's really only of female athletes that undergo sex verification. There's this website, the HHMI Biointeractive. Actually, they do a lot of cool stuff for teaching if you're interested in that. And this was great during the pandemic because they have a lot of like sort of pre-made lessons. And so a lot of the next part of this talk comes from there. And why, let's say a recent example of how this is relevant is this South African athlete, Proseminar, who had run into some issues with, let's say, whether she was qualified to run in the women's competition. And she is a genetic female. She produces eggs, but she does have a mutation that increases her testosterone level. So this is a graph that shows what is the rough distribution of testosterone for women, which is that red line. And this is, again, like why I say, you might say women cluster way down here in terms of is this binary, but look at men. And there's another graph I'll show you. They're all, there's a wide spectrum of testosterone levels in men. But the sort of competitive limit was set here at around 10, and a lot of intersex athletes, females, have them around 21. So she was banned from certain competitions. So, the question becomes, should we care about, is this fair? Should we we care about it. So this is is testosterone. So I would say that we should, if we care, sex is defined by your reproductive anatomy, eggs or testes, and not by testosterone. But the IOC might say they care because it might confer a performance advantage. And certainly the competitors thought that there was an unfair advantage. So this is a graph, and this is on that HHMI website, and it's was from an article of actually there was a female athlete who was trying to argue that we shouldn't use testosterone as a way to measure sex. And what they show here is the number of individuals that have certain testosterone levels, and then they're color-coded males. So females very much cluster at the low end, there's no doubt, right? But you can see that males have a wide spectrum of testosterone. And what I think is interesting is that there are females that are throughout here. There are much fewer of them, but they are about this range. And if you, and this is where I say, like, once you have your definitions, now you can talk to society what really matters. If you're going to say that a female that is around 20 has an unfair advantage of a female that's around 5, why does a male that's close to 30 not have an unfair advantage over a male that's close to 15? That's one thing I would throw out there. We're going to ask about why does this matter? So another aspect the people who wrote this article argue is that it's not testosterone, it's lean body mass that actually confers the advantage. And they show that here. This is, it's funny because they use gender when they mean sex. They're sort of arguing against that. But anyway, now testosterone is going to impact this. I would have loved to see them do a graph that showed testosterone mass. But what they're arguing is that we're arbitrarily choosing testosterone level as how we're going to evaluate who can compete. Is that fair? Now, the next thing I'll throw out there is this guy, who people have argued he has some sort of mutation, Marfan syndrome or other sign. That's neither here nor there. The point is he has tremendous number of genetic advantages. So his wingspan, he also has, he's double jointed. So the flexibility in both his feet for the dolphin kick, as well as his elbows to propel through the water, gives him a huge advantage. The short legs, the long trunk, but the lung capacity. He has a mutation that affects his lactic acid production. So, and this is for energetics, phenomenal advantage. And this is just like I say, we shouldn't let our politics inform our science, but this is my one sort of political, whatever. She was ruled she can't play because of a natural advantage that affects metabolic outcome. Michael Phelps was praised for having this insane genetic advantage. And in the same way, because of his lactic acid production. So I think this is where I would say, have your definitions, talk about what's important to society. I used to compete. I want to win, right? I like to play, but also we all want to win. But there's a lot about sports that maybe isn't all about the gold medal, because if it were, then why don't we just measure testosterone and sort of pass out medals for gold medal for having the most testosterone? So I think this is where we set our terms, and then we say, where does sex matter, and how does that impact what our goals of a society are? So the last thing I'll say on this is why I think sex matters is that it has tremendous impact on your health. So, and of course, reproductive health. Someone needs to hear that. Reproductive health is health, as well as other components of aging. So these are important things that impact an individual, and to the extent that they would have a disorder relating to this, of course, they would have also important healthcare needs. But I think this is where we can say, I would argue it's important to know binary. Okay, so now I'll just briefly touch on gender. So lots of definitions of gender. And I think the point that I want to make with this is that most of the definitions of gender, so you either find definitions that do not distinguish gender, that totally use gender interchangeably with sex, which is, I would think, completely wrong, or definitions that really don't talk about biology at all. And in fact, there's this definition that I found on a page, biology university, in their biology course. And these biologists say that gender is a social construct, humans made it up. Exclamation point. And I'm going to disagree with that and say, get to this gender, yes, it's kind of cute. My definition, or how I would define gender, is that it is referring to these behaviors or expressions that reflect an individual's identity, but importantly, that's sexual identity. It's part of their interaction as part of an extension of reproduction. It is continuous, so behavior is continuous. It occupies a spectrum. And I would further argue, importantly, that gender expression derives from both biological and cultural factors. The way I would distinguish that is that the specific expression or behavior is very culturally influenced. The tendency towards certain behaviors has a biological influence. So, and I'll show a little bit of data on that. So the gender unicorn, and this is where, the idea of the spectrum, the rainbow, continuous, so like a wave. And I think it applies. So it has all of these components: your identity, your expression, and who you may be physically or emotionally attracted to. So there are variations on this gender unicorn. They do have this sex assigned at birth, but I don't think, that may impact you how other people treat you at some level, but I prefer this genderbread person, which is very similar, but they sort of explicitly refer to the fact that the biological sex, there's something related to those hormones, your mixture of hormones that impact your tendency towards certain behavior. And I think that's important. Now, the degree to which all of these things contribute may never be known. It's hard to parse, but the evidence that some biological aspect contributes to this is significant, and I think we should consider that. Now, this is what I would say in terms of, at some level, an expression, right? How do you choose to dress? So in some cultures, it's not considered masculine to wear a skirt, right, of sorts. And others, it is very much so, right? So how the particular expression manifests is almost certainly influenced by culture to a very large degree. But the tendency, I would argue, the tendency that, or whatever your culture is, to express in a more masculine or feminine way would be influenced by biology at some level. So to the spectrum, this is just, that's more about how one presents themselves, but this has been shown to a certain degree. So the Kinsey scale, which was, everything is, they want to create a spectrum, but they still give boxes of numbers, right? These are we're always putting things in boxes. But the idea that most of us are somewhere, and these would be behaviors, these could be interests. But on top of that, there are people, you may be exclusively heterosexual, but within that, there's ranges to individuals who are very active and versus very conservative. So these things range across many variables. And in this concept, it's continuous. So I'm getting close to running out of time. What I want to show, well, one thing is that I would say, skip here, that I think argues strongly. There's a lot of studies that actually show across cultures that males have more tendencies towards, let's say, aggression or violence, among other traits. There's big 5 personality traits, so there's studies that show that. But I think the strongest evidence that there's something inherent in us that dictates our identity is the fact that we have transgender. And that if you listen to Elliot Page talk, he will tell you, he didn't have the vocabulary he knew from a very early age. So that, I think, argues strongly for there being something biological in gender. Now, the last thing I want to touch on, I'll try to do this really quickly, is the aspect of why morphology has more constraints. So behavior, if behavior is a spectrum, if behavior has all these potential, why doesn't morphology? So there's a hypothesis that's quite strongly supported, this hourglass model of development that refers to how much diversity in morphology can exist. And so if you look at vertebrate embryos, the early fertilized eggs, they are very different. Of course, the adults are very different. But at this mid-development, this stage when organs are forming and tissues are forming, we have these important interactions. Both morphology and gene expression is conserved. And so we'll use the example of the face, and this is where I need to go to that other, well, maybe I'll just skip the video for time. Our face or jaw forms from these multiple processes. So in particular, this process, the maxillary process, needs to fuse the medial and lateral process in order to form the midface. And the maxillary process inside your mouth is fusing the secondary palate. So failure of that fusion will form a cleft. So there was a study that basically looked at the shape, quantified the shape, did this in amniotes, and found that at these very early developmental stages, the earliest time you have those processes, there's a lot of shape difference. But if you track these differences over time, so looking at multiple developmental time points from the early prominent stage through this fusion stage to growth, you find that there are 2 main trajectories. So one that is for birds and others. And what they also found, so they tracked this morphospace. And then what I'll point out here is this entire box is a morphospace of all possible shapes. And you'll notice that in morphology, not all shapes are taken. They show, in fact, that the most similar stage is this stage where these facial processes need use. And they were able to, through experiments, manipulate the shape change. And they did this by manipulating some of these secondary signaling centers to change the growth. So they could change the growth trajectories in the face. What happens is that those embryos get clefts and die. So you can imagine that if that evolution were to, biology and development were to employ those gene regulatory networks, those animals would die. It's not, they wouldn't be passing those genes on. So the point is that shape is constrained by the fact that tissues need to interact in order to form their final shapes. And so that's the morphology has constraints that limit the possible morphospace. And it's not that development doesn't offer the opportunity, it's just that they're not viable. So in conclusion, I will just finish with this summary that I argue that sex is a morphological character. And as such, morphological character related to reproduction, the human bowel plan has 2 discrete binary states. That's the bowel plan. They do not change over time. In contrast, gender is this behavioral character. Behavior acts on a spectrum, it's continuous, and it also can change in a local lifetime. And the last thing I'll say is that before I said, well, I think sex is important, but reproductive health is health, and mental health is also health. And So sex and gender together make us who we are and impact not only our physiology, but are the way we interact in other aspects that can create. I'd like to thank my developmental biology students for encouraging me to think about these things. Brian for being my collaborator, friend, and would like to meet. And I can. I don't know how the time goes.
May have some sitting there doing.
How are you?
Nice journey today.
I don't know how.
Top right, it says chat, go right, that thing. Chat so far.
No question.
Regarding the evolution from asexual reproduction to sexual reproduction, would you say that it's basically females cloning themselves? And if that's true, would you consider like the female the default form and males to be like a?
So, so for example, if there are hermaphrodites in species that do that, they're female. So many of the asexually reproducing things don't necessarily have a sex, because if you don't have a gamete, this defined sex as having by the gamete, then I would say they don't have a sex, right? So certain things that produce asexually not be. The idea that the female reproductive pathway is default, I think, was something that for a while was thought, and those male genes turn on and they make maleness, right? I think now it's more nuanced than that. There's appreciation that we have, it's a switch. So there are gene networks working both pathways that interact and to mutually inhibit, make sure that one gets activated and the other not. So I guess the answer is probably, as much as I'd like to say females are, I don't think the evidence would.
Of course, yeah. Have there been any studies on trans individuals' testosterone levels prior to any hormone therapy?
That's a good question. I don't know, right? And so there are a lot of studies now that, like, we talk about, like, what is the source of your identity? Testosterone is going to play a role in that, but there's many other things that are known to contribute to that. So actually, I skipped over. There are people who say, well, downstream or related to hormones, things like calcium channels and other components, other genes that might be on the related to XY chromosomes, or genes that are normally on those chromosomes that are contributing to behaviors or personality, if you will. So I don't know for sure about the testosterone levels, but I would also say that I would not argue that it's testosterone levels that's primary driver of our gender identity. Yes.
Is there a way to use archaeological evidence to track known possibilities of your gametes that you're saying that perhaps we have mutated to make sex this, as your definition says, this binary, whereas could it have been more of that spectrum box that you were showing for the cleft previously?
So for sex, like archaeological evidence, just look at vertebrates, right? So that's the evo-devo part, right? So it's across vertebrates, but animals, right? So animals, sex is, there are a few, want to say like yeast or other single cell type organisms that have more unique mating systems, let's say. But in multicellular animals, sex is binary. So there's this tendency for a large and small gamete. So in terms of how reproduction occurs, yes. Now, in terms of gender, for sure, I mean, and I'm a lot of evidence of cultures, modern cultures that have concepts of different gender identity. And even like from archaeological evidence, like hunter-gatherers, there are people who argue like the shaman. So hunter-gatherers are a society that kind of had gender roles, if you will, or associated with biological sex. But then like the shaman, for example, or other sort of specialized individuals weren't necessarily fitting that role. That would be in some way a different role. So the idea like in human history that we have expressions that of our identity outside of this binary, I think is for probably as long as we can tell cultural evidence, right? But in terms of gametes, that's, yeah, it's just vertebrates have two sperm and egg, right? That's a binary. If you now the other thing too, like again, you can think we talk about these external characters, right? So what I showed you, those frogs, that the female had this sort of larger external anatomy compared to the male. For example, male birds don't really have external anatomy. They have these cloaca, which is basically reproductive and excretory tract, so that all is in the same opening, and they come together and they just sort of meet like that. That's how they mate, right? So in terms of aspects of sex related to the external morphology, yes, there's a lot of variation. But if we're going back to what I would argue is the important component of sex, the gametes, that's binary.
Okay. I think I know your answer to this question, but I'm going to throw it out there. So for your definition of sex, it still seems like an audience could say, well, that's fine that you come up with this definition and you come up with a justification for a definition, but it could still be seen as arbitrary in terms of how you're defining it. Because, and what I mean by that is you could draw that same line genetically, you could draw that same line hormonally, potentially. I mean, you could say, well, these are all necessary, but perhaps not sufficient things in terms of biology for reproduction. Why is gametes so essential, or gonads? Why are testes or ovaries?
To make the next individual. Ovary and sperm come together to create the embryo. And you can do that in a test tube. You don't need testosterone. So, so I totally agree that people can make their definitions as they want. But that's why I say from the evo-devo perspective, when we consider why does sex matter, it's really about that reproduction, which is the next generation, that next individual, which is the sperm and the egg coming together. And that's how you get a new individual. And that's all that needs to happen.
Sorry.
No,
Just
go
to
ahead.
add on, I really appreciated that you brought up citizen scientist and the importance of having cross-transferable definitions, especially as it relates to policymaking. But going off of, again, what you just said, when, these are just arbitrary lines and how sex is valued in society, it isn't necessarily valued by your chromosomes. I don't know how to fully put it into words, but when you use words like disorder or goes wrong, or that it doesn't conform to a body plan, it can be dangerous, to have these, broad generalizations that, if you're trying to apply these to policy makings, it's important to think about how these definitions are being used and who is being excluded.
Sure. And so I would also say that, like, well, from a standpoint of public health, it does, at some point, it does matter, right? In the same way that anything like that we call, and that's just a medical term, right? That's a medical term. And those individuals may need specific medical care, right? So I think that it is important. That is a term. So I would say politics of sex are difficult because they get at the core of who we think we are, right? Whereas a disorder of, if you have polydactyly, that doesn't seem to get at the core, right? So I understand that it's, it can be more challenging, right? And that's also why I say it's really important that we distinguish what is sex from what is gender. And that maybe sex is something that we don't necessarily, it's a personal thing with you and your doctor, right? And that we as humans in society utilize gender as what matters. Now, how would the Olympic Committee deal with that? That's their problem or whatever. But like, so this gets to the policy situation, because we do need to have policy on our physical health as well as other components of our mental health, right? Or other concepts of who we are. So yeah, I would say the other thing too is when you look at, they have that spectrum for sex, those individuals, those intersex conditions, and again, it depends on who's doing the calculation, it's like less than 1%. Right? So as are, you know, most of these other disorders, right? They are rare conditions. So I would say issues of gender variability is something that is more a bigger, bigger source of variation that is something that we need to talk about. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's something that we have to try to deal with sensitivity and what is the context in which you use those terms. But I still think that if we're thinking about medicine, or if we're thinking about evolutionary biology, these are important things that we need to think about. Is we talk about developmental bowel plans and if you have, let's say, conditions where robustness breaks down, and that's how I defined it there, as robustness breaks down, then that's a situation that usually requires a special, some sort of different healthcare often. So that's why I think it is relevant, and it doesn't. You know, I have kids when I give that polydactyly lecture come up to me after class and they're showing me, oh, their extra, you know, digit that they had removed, or things like that. And for them, it's basically something like a show and tell thing. It's exciting, right? And because it doesn't impact on who they are, and it shouldn't, right? In the same way, it doesn't devalue. There's nothing that reduces it as it would any other sort of lack of robustness, right? But because it impacts so close on our identity, I think that's why it's harder to talk about. All the more reasons why we need these conversations.
Just to offer another counterpoint,
Yes.
we use polydactyly a lot, but for more visible bodily differences, I think there's a lot of research in disability scholarship, because, you know, these bodily differences are important in their identity. And it is, you know, I think we're framing clinical medical sciences as objective, but they're not. And so I think, you know, maybe we should, you know, view bodily differences more on the spectrum instead of just, you know, saying this is abnormal and it needs to be fixed. Because maybe it is part of an important and, you know, deeply embedded part of their identity.
That's an interesting point. So, yeah. Thank you.
But good talk. I didn't.
And thanks for the participation. That point is, find a subject that gets people to think about things and to argue from a point that we can agree on, or say this is a valid and it matters for our society.
So, are you trying to say that sex is binary, but it doesn't matter that it's binary?
No, I think it matters. I mean, it matters if you want to have a child. It matters for certain aspects of your healthcare, but as you go through your daily life, doesn't normally necessarily have to impact you, right? I think your gender expression is more likely to impact you than your sex, but it definitely matters.
So you're saying that this, gamete production is binary, but it doesn't inform who we are as people.
Well, yeah, I would say that there is a part of our gender identity that relates to that. And again, it also depends. Some people value that very much. As I said, I don't think Elliot Page would have had these surgical operations if it didn't matter to him how it hurts and how it felt, right? So there are some individuals that it does really matter. Others, it doesn't, and that's just part of their personal expression. So to the extent that your way that you interact with society by any aspect of how you present yourself matters, I think that varies from person to person.
People that don't produce gametes.
So this is a very rare condition. They'll still have ovaries or testes. But there are people who do not produce, well, yeah, for example, they have testes, but they don't produce sperm. Sperm that are still infertile.
So are they sexless at that point?
I would say that their sex would be defined on if they have ovaries or testes.
Or intersex, and they had both.
So there are cases where you don't get degeneration of one of the ducts, right? So I would still argue that so that person would have to have a talk with their doctor, right? So in order to decide what they chose at the sex, right? To the extent that it mattered, right? When sex matters in society is if you have to go to a doctor, or if you need to reproduce, those people, if they're not going to have gametes, they're not going to reproduce, right? That person is still going to identify as their gender, so that they still have that ability to identify as. Yes. That's why I'm saying these are different things. And that's why we have the different concepts.
Well, then I feel like the argument here is then, I think you're actually making an argument that we need to maybe not be rigid with the definition per se, because if you're saying that with medical assistance, for instance, that males fall into this category of they're more prone to XYZ, females fall into this category because they're more prone to XYZ biologically, but perhaps we need to make medicine a broader spectrum to understand these differences more so than us trying to put it in a box. That perhaps, yes, okay, the male biology says that they're prone to prostate cancer. It doesn't necessarily mean that somebody who would have both sexes are more prone, less prone, equal prone. Depending on the biological makeup, of course, but this argument is actually opening the spectrum door to say we need to stop putting ourselves into boxes, get better medicine to understand the spectrum, to better relate and better serve all of the individuals, that we are actually cutting ourselves off to say, okay, but biologically, Elliot Page was born with female parts. But he produces in other ways, is masculine, is getting that testosterone. What medical predispositions is he prone to?
Yeah, so that, I mean, there's certainly research on people that take hormones that impacts their body for sure. Every individual deserves personalized care at some level, 100%. I think the point that, that I want to try to make is that we have roles or a place in society, right? But then we were also beings of nature. So trying to understand the intersection of the components. And I think that there's value in distinguishing between those components, right? What is our reproductive biology versus an identity society.
So you said you think there's a value in distinguishing. You mean there's a value from like a medical treatment standpoint, but not necessarily a societal, like then when we fill out forms, the little N, the little F.
Forms are terrible.
Yeah, but like in a medical setting, there's an actual advantage to having a medical professional understand what your biological makeup is. But outside of a medical setting, the societal advantage or disadvantage to identifying what your reproductive organs are, essentially like not necessary, because that's separate from your individual identity. The little form, like, does my driver's license need to announce that I have a vagina? Like, is that important when I go to a bar?
Would be great if it said vagina or penis. That would be more
I would
fun.
be much happier to check that box, but
What you say, when it comes to public policy, one of the things is money. So like, let's say intersex individuals represent a 0.5%. When public policy makers are deciding where to put their money, it's just like any other orphan drug. There's a reason why we passed like orphan drug laws is because there are genetic diseases that many fractions of the people have, and there's just no money to fund those diseases. And these are any disease, just cystic fibrosis or something like that, right? But and so when you talk about like, why can't this and just treat everybody completely perfectly the way they all should be treated, it's just because we're slicing the pie. And maternal care is gonna drive a big chunk of that, and that's like a biological thing,
again, the medical standpoint, I completely understand the need to have categories to identify to get the appropriate care.
Right. And if someone, you can imagine if someone is on the table and you're gonna operate on them, you're gonna wanna know what their organ sets are on the inside. So, I mean, you don't have your driver's license, why I would say,
Yeah, so
it's a vagina, like I want them to know when I'm on the slab, before they decide to just take my organs, give them to someone else. If they're going to make a stab at trying to save me, I do want them to know sort of what's going on inside. So there is some value to all that. I mean, it's in terms of policy, I would argue.
It's also, it's an epistemology.
You guys make a good point because for
I think that's coming from there.
Yeah, it's, yeah.
a person identifies as, there was a lady, she was Black, but when you looked at her, she did look like she could be Caucasian, and she identifies as a Caucasian woman. So most people in the medical world know that people of African descent are more prone to sickle cell anemia. We do know that other humans get it too, but in the medical world, we do know that, Africans or African Americans are more prone to have this blood issue. So when she went to the doctor and she's identifying, as a Caucasian woman, they didn't run those necessary tests right off bat. Does that make sense what I'm saying? But had she would have, said that, I'm born Black, African American, they probably would have ran those tests sooner to be able to help her. Does that make sense? Is that kind of the
100%.
subject that we're on with this? That's where we're at, right?
Yeah, and actually, the whole nother category of individuals of African American descent and healthcare, right? Because not only risk factors, but disease manifestation on darker skin, right? So, or how different not just something that you can observe on the skin, but how those specific diseases manifest. There's been a huge issue of that's come up in the last few. In the last few
Right, but yeah, so I was just saying that to circle back to I understand the medical terms and the biological terms of the sex of, you know, the reproductive system, as well as the line between, you know, people who identify as a male or female that may not have those sexual reproductive organs. Does that make sense? So I'm just letting you guys know that I understand what it is. It's a fine line. There's expression, and then there's things that, you know, we have within us that would help us out medically.
And yeah, thank you for sharing that.
As a medical professional myself, I would like to say that medicine is bad at stuff. So these conversations can also help influence how medicine goes about being medicine, because there are lots of balls that get dropped and lots of boxes that people get put into and are not receiving the care that they would like to receive. It's a mess. Anyway, so
Well, as someone who gives medical care, yeah, I complain, and as someone who is, I think about things. Medicine likes to put people in boxes more so than anything. And medical doctors are trained to kind of think in boxes and flowcharts. And
yes,
so there's a lot we need to do to, which is out of my area, but yes, we could be less box-like in
I'm thinking of this person that presents looks white and they didn't test her for sickle cell because that's not a standard test for a white person. I'm like, well, why wouldn't you be testing them for what they're symptomatic for? But also, sometimes we don't. We, a doctor and a couple of nurses look at a patient and they do. We put them in a box. We also don't really even have that much time. So box putting helps us get to the, standard set of care, which works for most people, right? So arguably, okay, it works. There's so many people that fall through the cracks and it's because they were boxed. You're white, you're black, you're male, you're female, you're fat, you're skinny, you're tall.
or bias, right? And I think, so that's part of the healthcare issues is that certain people might not get tested for certain things. And it's been shown, right, that we all have biases, and the idea that certain people don't get this disease. And so you're biased against that, whether irrespective of whatever symptoms they may have. Or, so we all have our biases. That's why I tried to lay out my bias as being someone that, from the perspective of a developmental biologist and being interested in how life evolves and whatnot, that is having an epistemological framework. You stated from the beginning, right? Try to be aware of what biases you have and lay that out in the conversation.
Well, as somebody who's never really thought about evolutionary biology, I mean, some classes I had to take anyway, and it really only briefly gets touched upon, unless that's your field. I'm thinking that your perspective has added to my understanding of complexity. So thank you.
Welcome. And I thank you all for your participation, right? And when I write this book, and it's going to be a task because there's a lot to write, I have, I'm going to give it to people who hopefully will give me this kind of feedback, right? Because we want to be able to engage in these conversations, and we want to be able to find a way that we can at least understand each other. Perspectives. Thank you for inviting me.
You, yeah,
This chair goes back.
they see you right here.
See ya.
I know how to get those.
Since 2015.